Thank you for just sharing like your insights on what that might look like for you. Appreciate that. If you need to think about it, you can hop on our Facebook group and fill it out there as well at any time, okay? Thanks. All right, different way to start, but I want to shift gears and I want to highlight that in 2022, Psychology Today featured an article, and this is the title of the article, and some of you are going to be familiar with this idea. It said, Stoicism as a fad and a philosophy. And it was acknowledging that something had happened in the American discourse. An ancient way of philosophical thought had found its way into popular American culture, and American men and American women were practicing being Stoics. It was finding its way into business places and fitness routines, and it became so and is so pervasive that you've got leading internet state places like Modern Stoicism and How to Be a Stoic and the Daily Stoic and Traditional Stoicism. And the bottom line is this. Imagine that you take all that mental and physical and emotional energy that you spend worrying about what others think or not worrying about what others think, or worrying about what will happen tomorrow or not worrying about what will happen tomorrow, or worrying about the past, and it was all about control. And Stoicism offers this invitation. You can be freed up and pay attention to the moment you're in, because that is the only moment that you're in. All right, so this, if you're not familiar with Stoicism, then I'm going to capture it in a couple memes. So this is the universe before you make a mistake. And this is the universe after you make a mistake, right? The universe just did not change that much because of something you did or forgot to do. Or those of you who remember the Scooby-Doo days, the source of most of my problems, I'm going to unmask the villain. It is my own attitude, my own actions, my own choices. Now, the idea of Stoicism has probably been most popularized by Ryan Holiday and his series of books, which really took off with The Obstacle is the Way. And listen to how he describes kind of contemporary Stoicism. The obstacle in the path becomes the path. Never forget, within every obstacle is an opportunity to improve our condition. I think generally, even if we don't know what Stoicism is, we'd be like, yeah, I mean, I'm kind of familiar with that idea, but no one has asked me what happened the last few decades and why this took off and why it's become, has such a handle in our culture. But I have a suspicion that the whole movement actually started with a movie in the 80s about a kid named Ralph, whose mom moved him to a new town where he was confronted by a bunch of bullies who practiced karate. And Ralph, after one day getting his bike messed up, was befriended by the local handyman gardener named Mr. Miyagi. And he taught him about how the obstacle could become the path, could become the way.
I promise teach karate. That's my part. You promise learn. I say you do. No question. That's your part. Deal?
Steel?
Yes. First wash all the car, then wax. Wax.
But why do I have to wash all the car?
Remember, deal. No question.
Yeah, but
Right. Wax on, right hand. Wax off, left hand. Wax on, wax off. Breathe in through nose, out the mouth. Wax on, wax off. Don't forget to breathe. Very important. Wax on, wax off.
So he wants to learn karate, and he learns how to wash and wax cars and how to sand and varnish porches and decks, and then eventually he puts it all together, and this obstacle becomes his path, and most of you know how this thing ends, right? And so, and now if you show this to your kids, like who are in high school, and you're like, this is an awesome movie, they'll be like, that was the lamest movie ever. But for some of us, it's got a little holding power. Somehow it's easy for you and I to grab hold of this idea that there's something good in the obstacle. There's something good. So I want to ask you a question. Have you ever experienced the obstacle becoming the path in your life? Maybe on a very basic sense, it would be, you know what, I got up, I went to class, I worked on my grades, and I got that degree. That was an obstacle that became my path to something. Maybe it was a relationship, an experience, a move, and like turn to the person next to you and just say, yeah, there's a few places that I can say the obstacle became my path. And then we'll jump into what this has to do with our predecisions. All right, take just a second. So, Stoicism, and maybe the most familiar Christian expression of Stoic idea. So you take the idea of the obstacle and you apply it to the deep wisdom of Jesus Christ. It's found in the Serenity Prayer. Many of you are familiar with this prayer. It's written by Reinhold Niebuhr in the 1930s. He was a Christian pastor and theologian, and he essentially grabbed this idea of what does it look like to trust God with my life. And you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to show it to you real quick. But I also want to pray it over you for those of you who would like that. For this reason, I realize that any given time that we gather together, we bring in our lives. We bring in the aging parent that we are taking care of, or we bring in our own aging as the parent. We bring in our home conflicts and what we're trying to work out at home and the challenges we have in our singleness or in our relation, in our marriage or with our kids or our parents. We bring in real end of life matters that we're in, or also the beginning of wondering if that diagnosis is going to be a discussion about end of life. And so you think about all of this and you go, and then we come in and I throw stuff at you for a while, and I just want to pause for a second, and I want to offer you this prayer. I think this prayer is a gift. I'd encourage you to take it with you, but I want to offer it to you. It'll be on the screen and I'll read it. And if you need this morning, please receive it, okay? God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardships as the pathway to peace, and taking, as Jesus did, this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it. Trusting that Jesus will make all things right if I surrender to his will, that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with him forever in the next. Amen. Amen. So Stoicism, honestly, ends up short. It doesn't have the answers to the life that we're looking for. It doesn't give the solution to the problem that confounds us. It offers a way, and you could maybe capture it in the contemporary practice of the ice bath. And there's some ice bathers in here this morning. Probably a lot of you that are like, I'm disciplined. I get down. I put myself in cold water. It's good for me. That would be like a modern expression of Stoic practice. But we need to explore the pre-decision around how Stoicism runs short and how actually we can find a flourishing full life in Jesus Christ. So this whole series started with this idea. Quality decisions lead to a quality life. And from week one when we said it, those of you who are suspicious were like, what does that mean? What's a quality decision? And what's a quality life? Am I just supposed to make quality decisions? And how do I know they're quality? And how do I know my life is quality? And so the homework, the daily life work we gave was, when faced with this decision, I have pre-decided to take this action. It's just kind of a way to think about our relationships, our jobs, our school, our sports, our clubs, our homes, our neighborhoods, when faced with, and then we've given you, and today we're in our final two, a series of pre-decisions. To begin by saying, I am ready, I've positioned my life under the lordship of Jesus Christ, so I am ready for whatever life brings to me. I'm consistent and devoted in my practice of following Jesus. I am generous. We talked through generosity last week, is looking at your chronology, your time, and your craft, your talent, and your capital, your treasure, and saying there's freedom in viewing these as gifts to bless others with and to let go of, whether you have very little or whether you have very much. And today we're going to jump into the final two, and to me, sort of the most important two, because they bring it together. I am faithful, and I am a finisher. So a conversation about faithfulness. To get to the essence of what it means to be faithful, I'm going to spend the morning talking about one word. I'm going to make like an audacious claim here. One word that will change your life. One word that is the quality decision that leads to the quality life, and one word that is the foundation of faithful. It is a word that set me free in my life. Set me free from a cycle of self-destruction. Fortunately, most of this freedom came early in my life, and I didn't have to carry it with me into this time in my life. Due to the sexually broken home I was brought up in, set me free from an early addiction to pornography, set me free from that so I could walk into my adult life free from that. Set me free from compulsive and sometimes violent behavior. Set me free from fractured relationships in my family so that I could be connected with and have peace with the family that I am part of, the family that is me, and the family that I came from. And in this freedom, it has prepared me to be a man, to be a dad, to be a husband, to be a neighbor, and to be the pastor of this church. And the word is a word that puts you, faithful is so much better of a word. Like, listen to how it sounds. I just want to be faithful. Doesn't that sound nice? Who doesn't, right? Who doesn't? But the word puts you on your heels. It's obedience. Obedience is the pathway to faithfulness. Now, here's a classic definition of obedience. Submission to another's authority. So there's a lot of social science about how Americans think about obedience. And you may not know this, but they don't like it very much. All right? It's not even in the top list of things parents want for their kids. I mean, they want their kids to obey them, but the idea of like go into the world, they want to be successful before obedient. Submission to another's authority. And I've just been having a lot of troubles with this church, and I thought it'd be a good day to, no, just kidding. I'm not the authority. You're not the authority. Because the most life-giving definition of obedience is the right response to the way of Jesus. Obedience is always relational. It is always tied to, do I trust the person who is asking me or commanding me what I must do with my life? It's the right response to the way of Jesus. And I say that because you and I, we all have a bottom line when it comes to our quality decisions. And I mean, so if you're a student in high school right now, this has come forward when you thought, who should I date? Or what should I do with my time? Or how should I spend my money? Or what should I do with this person I used to be really close friends with? And now we can't even talk anymore. Or take it all the way out into your adult life. Where should I live? What should I do in this relationship that I'm in that's not going the way I want it to go? What should I do with my kids, or what should they do with me? What should I do with this job I don't like? There's this bottom line in decision making. And I want to offer to you what I would say is the irreducible minimum of the bottom line for a follower of Jesus. Now, if you're not following Jesus, you'll look at this and you have to go, what do I do with this? Because that's not my system. Okay, but so I would just say test it against your system. The bottom line is the core determinant for the follower of Christ is what obedience to God requires of me. That's the quality decision. What does obedience to God require of me? Now, I think about this, like, I don't even know formally how often I think that way. So I put it on the screen and I put it in your notes because I'd love for us to explore this idea that if Ryan Holiday in Stoicism says the obstacle in the path becomes the path, so therefore the obstacle becomes the way, let's put that in terms of obedience to the way of Christ. Obedience is the obstacle. I got some sideways looks at the first service, and I'll probably get some here as well, because some of you are so kind-hearted. You're like, no, I just love to obey Jesus. And I'm like, always? Because when you're faced with obedience to Christ, most of us will go, oh, I don't want to do that. And it becomes an obstacle. But it is actually what I'm saying to you this morning, that it's actually the way. Through that obstacle, through obedience becomes the way. I'm going to say obedience 1,000,000 times this morning so I can normalize it, so we don't feel like I have to be on our heels with obedience, and we can just put it out there. Because, so taking this idea, we're going to go to the story of the calling of the disciples. And we're going to look at this reality that obedience is greater than talent. It's greater than opportunity. It's greater than the family of origin you come from. It's greater than your freedom. It is greater than having followers and influence. It is greater than favor. And we see, so we're going to test that, okay? We're going to look at the life of Peter and some of his friends and how they encountered Jesus. And when you read these stories, you're probably going to go, what's that got to do with my life? Like, I get the spiritual context of it. It's a story about Jesus, and I like stories about Jesus. And so I want to give you a framework. Use your imagination first as you listen. Imagine what's actually happening. And the second thing is this whole story that we're about to look at takes place in someone's real life. It doesn't take place in like a quaint fisherman and some neat Bible story, and Jesus comes along and the wind is blowing his hair slightly back, and he's got this really square jawline, and he comes up, and if you're old enough, you've been in the church long enough, these were little felt characters that went up on a board, and so it's hard not to see these. It's just like neat little felt characters. This is Peter's life. This is his work. This is his relationships. This is his hope. This is his dreams. That's where the story unfolds. A real person, timestamp. So let's go to the story. We're going to be in Luke chapter 5, verses 3 to 11 to start. Luke begins. He, Jesus, got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and he asked him to put out a little from the shore, and then he sat down and taught the people from the boat. So Jesus is just taking advantage of the amphitheater effect of being out on the water and speaking to large crowds who are on the shore. So Simon puts him out a little bit. People, they're aware that something special is going on with Jesus, but he's not yet a follower of Jesus. His bottom line is not yet, what does obedience to the Lord require of me? This interaction takes place in his job. He's a fisherman. That's what he does. Your job is what you do vocationally, or the children you're raising, or the classes you're studying, or the sport you're committing yourself to, or the philanthropic work you're doing. That's where this is unfolding. It's an all play. I love it. We all get to be part of this story because we could be Peter. When he finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep water and let down your nets for a catch." And Simon said, "Master," he recognizes Jesus' authority. He said, "We've worked hard all night. We haven't caught anything. But because you say so, I will let down the nets." This would be like Jesus speaking into whatever door you're going to walk through tomorrow to go to work or go to school. Whatever you're going to do with your time tomorrow, if you don't have those demands on you, if you're in retirement, so what are you going to do with your life? And Jesus looks at Peter and goes, "Peter, I want you to do something that doesn't make sense." Peter's the professional fisherman. Jesus is not. He's a preacher. He's a rabbi. He talks about philosophy and the meaning of life. And he says to Peter, "Peter, I need you to push out." So Peter says to him, "Master, I've worked hard all night. We haven't caught anything. My life it didn't work. But because you say so, we'll do it again." Listen to what happens. When they'd done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. And when Simon Peter saw this, he fell down on his knees and he said, "Go away from me, Lord. I'm a sinful man." I mean, he misses the opportunity to 10x this thing and say, "Jesus, come fishing with me every day." Right? And then we'll get some factories around the world, and I mean our fish. Like he's just like, "Oh my goodness, this is different. The one who told me to do the thing that doesn't make sense in my vocation and my life is different than me. And Jesus, you're fine. I'm not. Go away from me." It's Peter's response. And then Jesus said to Simon, "Don't be afraid." Making the bottom line of your life listening to my voice. Don't be afraid. From now on, you'll fish people. Very iconic, classic Christian language, becoming a fisher of men. This language is in this story because it happens in a boat while they're fishing. From now on, this thing that you do here, it's going to take on more significance, and you're going to do it with hearts and with minds and with lives. From now on, you will fish for people. So they pulled their boats up on shore and left everything and followed him. This is the calling of the disciple Peter. This is the moment where his life forever changes. He leaves everything and follows Jesus. And then for 3 years, he experiences miracles. He experiences the blind having sight, the mute speaking, those who can't walk finding their feet. They even experience those who are dead coming back to life. They watch thousands get fed from just a little bit of food. And time again, they see Jesus confront religious leaders, Roman leaders, people who've made themselves their own authority, people who have taken on the victim mentality and said, if I just had a different life, then things would... They see Jesus confront all of these. Now we're staying in the fishing theme, so we're going to go back to another fishing story that ends at the end of those 3 years. And it's kind of a parallel. But before I get to that story, I think This is why Peter walked away from everything he knew and said, my new bottom line is, what does the voice of this man require of me? A faithful encounter with Jesus leads to an obedient response. It's a faithful encounter with the superabundant person of Jesus Christ that leads to an obedient response. The challenge is when we feel like we should have an obedient response and we haven't had that encounter with Jesus. And so for so many of us, obedience is out of reach. It just feels like it's out there and I can't quite get to it because Jesus is a hobby or an elective. Certainly not a required course. Or maybe even you've looked at the teachings of Jesus and said, you know what? If I follow this, I'll be a better manager, a better boss, and Jesus becomes just like a tool, like a life coach to level us up in how we're living. But none of those things are the same as a faithful encounter. Peter had a faithful encounter. Jesus stepped into of all things, his work and said, Peter, not only do I want to use your work, I want you to listen to me. And even though what I say doesn't make sense. And so he steps into that. Peter has a faithful encounter. He leaves everything. And then look what happens 3 years later. But there's a few events that unfold just before this scene. One night, Jesus is praying in a garden with his close friends. He's recently celebrated the Passover supper. And Judas, one of his followers, comes with a group of soldiers. And he greets Jesus with a kiss. And Jesus is then arrested. And he's dragged off to a series of trials. And the legitimacy of these trials is historically, like were they even allowed? But it doesn't matter. They happened. And the text says he's spit on. He's the one who was giving sight to the blind is now being spit on. The one who walked into Lazarus' tomb and said, Lazarus, I need you to come up from the dead and come back to life, is now being mocked and scorned. That's the capstone of the 3 years they spent together. Jesus, beaten and bloodied, carries his cross to a hill called Golgotha, or the skull. He's nailed to that cross and he dies a criminal's death. And he's buried. And the next thing we hear is after a frenzied few days of denying Jesus, running for cover, not sure what was going to happen, they do love this man, even dead. And so a few of his followers go to his tomb to finish a few burial rites that are important to them. And when they get to the tomb, they discover that Jesus' body isn't there. And Mary, one of his followers, not his mom, Mary, one of his followers, bumps into a gardener in the tomb area. And he says, why are you so sad? And she says, because I'm looking for my Lord and I can't find his body anywhere. And she realizes she's talking to Jesus. There's a supernatural moment. And her heart is filled with joy. And she runs back to all of the other discouraged, disheartened, disappointed people. And she says, Jesus is alive. The fundamental focal point that changes all of history. It's the only reason Eastwind has a little plot of land here. And we're trying to figure out what you think about a 12:30 service. Jesus is alive. He reveals himself to the disciples. But they don't quite know what it means yet. So we go into our next fishing story. Same guys, same scenario. It happened this way. We're now in John 21. So we just covered 3 years. Notice the parallel. It started with a fishing story, and it ends for Peter with a fishing story. Where in John 21, it says, it happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples were together. And Peter thinks to himself and he says, I'm going to go fish. It's what I did before I met Jesus. We've had this wild circumstance and turn of events. I don't know what it means. So I'm going to go back to what I know how to control, what I know how to do. And his friends say, we'll go with you. So they went out, got in the boat, and that night they caught nothing. See the parallel that's happening here? Same scenario. Jesus is going to insert himself back into this. He's going to make a really important point for them to understand. They caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore. But the disciples did not realize it was Jesus. This could be miraculous. It could also be it's dark out. It's different time. There's not lights everywhere. You can't see who people are. So they don't realize it's Jesus. And he calls out to them. He says, friends, have you caught any fish? And look at their answer. No, they answered. Same scenario. And this man on the shore says, throw your nets on the right side of the boat. Because little did you know, the fish were on the right side, not the left side. Throw your nets on the right side of the boat and you'll find some. And when they did, they were unable to haul in the nets because of the large number of fish. And I was thinking about these two stories, and I was thinking about obedience and what it means to be just like a person, trying to figure out, what does the will of God require of me? How am I supposed to live? How do I know that a quality decision will lead to a quality life? And I realized something when I look at this story. I realized that this reality, that obedience can change your present circumstances without altering our present situation. So many of us, this is how we approach our disappointments. I need a new job. I need a new neighborhood. I need a new spouse. I need a new family. I need a new city. I need a new state that's more politically aligned with me. I'm on and on and on. These aren't wrong. It's not wrong to go, where am I living? What am I doing? But notice so often what we're saying is, I need a situation change, and then I can live the life I want to live. I was thinking about this reality in my own life, that what Peter experiences is when he puts those nets down after a night of fishing and not catching anything, and he has such a huge haul, the nets are breaking, his situation hasn't changed. But by listening to the voice of Jesus, his circumstance is radically new. I was 2017, I just felt like it was time for me to step out of the church I was at and into something new. And so I was looking at some things. I was kind of excited about a few opportunities, and I started to go down this road. And when you start to go down a road that a new situation will improve things for you, your heart can get all torn up, right? Like, it's hard to be at peace where you are because you're waiting for the new situation. And I was interviewing with some churches and things, and in the midst of that, one day my wife, Emily, comes home with, we're talking about moving, like the future and what it could be, and she comes home with a peach tree. And I'm like, well, what's that? You don't plant fruit trees if you're not going to be around. And she's like, well, no, we're going to plant this tree as a reminder that this is where we are. And until we're not here, we're going to take care of this tree, and we're going to wait for fruit on it. And so we planted the tree, and every day I'd walk to work, and I'd walk by this peach tree. And it made me realize, Lord, I can get so busy thinking obedience is like finding a life that works for me versus saying, what does obedience to your will require of me? Oh, Lord, you have me in an obstacle right now. The relationship that I've committed my life to is starting to fray and fall apart, because that happens. That's some of our stories in here. Before I decide a new situation is the way forward, I'm going to get on my knees with you, and I'm going to peach tree this thing. This is what I have. What do you require of me? The only person who can answer that is you. You can't make someone else answer that for them. And so I walked by that peach tree over and over and over. I shut down a few opportunities in different places, and then my youngest kid said, hey, Dad, why don't we move to Boise? We've never been to Boise. We didn't know it was nice. If you came from Winnemucca, I apologize in advance. I thought it was like Winnemucca. And so I Googled churches hiring Boise. I see some of the people who were part of those first interactions. And all of a sudden, in 2019 and 2020, I'm in a conversation with Eastern Community Church. And I think about that. Here we are 4 years later. For me, this has been such a blessing to be part of this community, to share in what God's doing here. But I wanted a situation change so much that I could have missed out on this. I could have missed out. But instead, I began to listen to God. What do you require of me? What do you require of me? And it was going to a city we hadn't visited, to be part of a church we'd never set foot on the ground. It all happened via Zoom because of COVID. Some of you remember when you saw my picture the first time, you were like, oh no. Like, what's the decision-making process at this church? Like, So when we think about this, that obedience can change our present circumstances without altering our present situation, then we get to this situation. But so what drives us to obedience? And I was part of this Bible philosopher and theologian named Christopher Watkin was doing a class, and he described it this way, which I loved. He said there's this N-shaped dynamic of religion that we can get caught up in. And the N-shaped dynamic looks like this. We can say, if I make a sacrifice to God, if I'm religiously good enough, or I obey whatever the things I'm supposed to obey are, then God will reward me. He said, but that's not the biblical story. the biblical story with God's super generous creation account. He didn't have to, but he did. And his redemption and restoration through all of human existence to the cross of Jesus Christ and the starting of the church. And he said, the story of the Bible is that God reaches down with his unmerited grace. And when you have an encounter with Jesus, then you begin to ask yourself, what does following Jesus require of me? And we respond in joyful and obedient thanks. So now we're going to jump into Peter's life after these two fishing incidents and look at how seriously did he take listening to Jesus. So this happens in the book of Acts. Peter's preached a sermon to a huge crowd. The sermon was kind of boring. If you read it, if I read it to you, you'd be like, that was boring. There's no jokes in it. There's not one reel or meme. It's just like, this is who Jesus is. 3,000 people give their lives to Christ that day and say, I'm now going to ask, what does following Jesus require of me? So Peter and the other followers of Jesus are on the move. They're going all throughout Jerusalem telling everybody about what they call the good news. And they get in trouble for it. The apostles were brought in and made to appear before the Sanhedrin. And they were questioned by the high priest, the same people who not long before arrested Jesus and hung him on the cross. If you don't think Peter had that vision in his mind, these are the same people that crucified Jesus. And he broke no law. And they're brought in before these people. And the interaction that happens is so wildly simple. They say, we gave you strict orders not to teach in this name. Yet you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching, and you're determined to make us guilty of this man's blood. And Peter and the other apostles reply, we must obey God rather than human beings. That's it. That's the obstacle is the obedience, but it becomes the path to a flourishing life with Jesus Christ and a flourishing life amongst our neighbors where we can love God and love our neighbor, including our enemy. It's right there. We must obey God rather than human beings. And when I look at this, though, I go, all right, it's like, 2024 America. Like, we're pretty confident in our freedom and our authority. So I'm like, well, I don't obey other human beings. I obey me. But you're still a human being. I must obey God rather than myself. I must obey God rather than other human beings. And so I was thinking about this. I'm going to end with something practical that maybe you're not even sure how it fits here. The challenge with submitting your life to Jesus Christ is that you have to break up with some pretty serious relationships, not people, but commitments you have made, things that you think are true and things that you think work, things you have trusted your life to. And so because I believe we are at a disrupted state with God and with ourselves and with others, it has a few ways it plays out. We ignore God's grace and we absolutize ourselves. We make ourselves the big deal in the story, right? And so we end up trying to solve this disrupted reality with pride. I can fix this. I can do this. It's kind of the heart of Stoicism. I personally, of all the classic philosophies, love Stoicism, but it falls short. I can do this. And pride works its way out in its most extreme forms. It hurts and crushes people. Or we ignore God's grace, and instead of absolutizing ourselves, we negate ourselves. And we end up hating ourselves. We never think we're quite good enough. I see this just as much as pride. I don't think the big issue is just pride. There's also this, I'm just not worth anything. But those are just opposite sides of the same disruption. Or we ignore God's grace and we overindulge and act like there are no limits. And this one just fascinates me because living as if there are no limits always ends up hurting us, whoever does it, however it's lived out. Or we reject God's grace and we're just like, I just need something to follow. So we worship a thinker, an idea, a practice, a job, an outcome. We idolize something. And how this works out is I'm going to just think with me real quick here. We are made finite. Here's what I mean by that. We all die. That is the most finite thing you could experience, is this life that you have coming to an end. We are made finite, but we're also made free. And when you take freedom and finite and you put them together, it's a really interesting and anxiety-inducing human experience because there's part of us that knows that my whole life is a life of limits. And there's part of us that goes, I am free. I don't need any limits. And those two working together create like the anxious state of humanity. And so we're at the place, it's not new, but we're at the place where if I could bottle up an ideal of like the American dream now, it would be like you just live your life limitless. And I go, oh, practically, but there are limits. We're finite. Get in your car, speed into a brick wall. That is a finite experience. You cannot limitlessly escape that. Okay, but that's crazy. We wouldn't go there, okay? How about this? Work a ton, don't sleep, don't eat when you should eat. What happens to you over time, right? You just become a wreck because you are finite. You have to have limits, but you're free. And so we just live in this anxious place. Why am I free if I'm finite? Why am I finite if I'm free? And here's how humanity's been known to resolve that. Well, we say, my way out of this human anxiety is going to be power. I'm going to force my way out of it. Or it's going to be intellectual. I'm going to learn my way out of it. Or it's going to be moral. I'm going to be a good person my way out of it. Or even in a setting like this, it's going to be religious. I'm going to do church stuff my way out of it. And the other alternative is what Peter discovered, to say, what does the will of the Lord require of me? I'm going to trust God as the source of my security. Because yes, I am finite, and yes, I am free. But I can't balance those two, and God will lead me through. One pastor calls this journey a long, or this act, a long journey in the same direction. And so how do you know, this is where we're going to shift, how do you know what like God requires of you? And I'd put it this way, that obedience is the right response to God's commands. The beautiful thing is this isn't supposed to be shrouded in mystery. How do you know what God's commands are? So if you go back and look at 2,000 years of church history and you explore, how do people have a thriving relationship with God? You find habits, practices that they get good at, just like you get good at other habits and practices in your life. These are spiritual habits and practices. And when I put this list up, it's like, I really want something more exciting. Like, every day go hike Lucky Peak and God will appear to you in the clouds and he'll tell you what to do that day. But actually, probably what I have to do is look at these very classic historical practices of a follower of Christ, there from the very beginning. And I have to go, okay, so first it was the teaching of the apostles, and then it became the collected scripture. I need a Bible reading habit. If I want to follow the commands of Jesus, I have to know what they are. And he says all of Scripture tells you who he is and what he's about. So I'm going to do that. Now, here's the thing. It's hard. Some of you might say, no, reading the Bible's easy. I don't have a brain like you. The Bible's hard. It's 66 books across many genres with different authors and different time periods. It is work. But good things are work. Prayer. A couple weeks ago, we talked about the idea of kneeling 3 times a day in prayer because your body is part of how you encounter God. And so just try something, kneel in prayer. I was talking to someone about when they go into work where they're encountering some anxiety. I said, just close your blinds, kneel in prayer and say, God, this is your job, not mine. So will you help me do it in a way that honors you? Get on your knees and say that. Generosity that we talked about last week. Actually, for 2,000 years, a key discipline of those who say they encounter Christ. And I think I know why. Generosity fights materialism and making idols out of stuff. Set your heart free to hear from God. And community, and I love this. So these aren't the only 4. Some of you who are more savvy, you'd be like, well, what about repentance and solitude and Sabbath and celebration? And there's so many, but these 4 always show up. A Bible habit. A prayer practice. Generous living. Committing yourself to rejecting privacy and isolation and being in community with people. Through serving, through joining in each other's living rooms, through cultivating friendships across your neighborhood that currently, it's hard to do, right? So let's do this. Now, James, a little bit later on, as these habits are beginning to form, and I'd love for you to maybe walk away and go, okay, I want that. Just make a decision about what you do want to hear from God, how you want to approach that. James is writing to the early church, and we're going to end with this. He says, don't merely listen to the word and so deceive yourself. Do what it says. And this book, we studied James a couple years ago. It's one you just kind of wish like he took a class on tact, but he didn't. He's just like, hey, don't merely listen and deceive yourself. Do what it says. And then he gives one of the most iconic, I think, word pictures you'll find in the New Testament. He says, anyone who listens to the word but doesn't do what it says is like someone who looks at his face in the mirror and after looking at himself goes away and immediately forgets what he looks like. And he's giving a picture of what it means to have your irreducible minimum be. What does the will of God require? What does Jesus command? What does Jesus command? Most of us, when I say that, I usually mean me. Most of us, when I encounter what Jesus commands, my gut is to go, no, thank you. Like that doesn't seem to line up with my self-preservation. That doesn't seem to line up with my idea of how I'm going to get through this. And James says that, Carlos, sometimes you're like a guy who looks in the mirror, walks away, and can't remember what he looks like. And then he goes on to say, but whoever looks intently into the perfect law, Jesus Christ, who Jesus said that what you'll find in the scriptures is the story of me and my law. Whoever looks into the perfect law that gives freedom and continues in it, not forgetting what they've heard, but doing it, they will be blessed in what they do. Quality decisions lead to a quality life. So here's the thing about obedience. It touches every area of our lives. So every interaction becomes an opportunity to add value to someone else's life. Every resource becomes an opportunity to multiply good in your neighbor's lives. Every choice becomes an opportunity to obey God. Every single choice becomes an opportunity to say, Jesus, what do you require of me? Every act of obedience leads to a quality life. It's the whole if you say so that Peter said to Jesus on that night after fishing. Jesus, we fished all night. We didn't catch anything, but if you say so, we'll do it one more time. And so his commands encompass every area of our lives. What we do with our thoughts, what we do with our time, what we do with our money, what we do with our bodies and our energy, what we do with our sex and sexuality, what we do with our thumbs, what we do at work, what we do at home, what we do when we're alone, and what we do when we're with others. Jesus is wanting to embed himself into all of these interactions in your life. All of these commands. But here's the thing about commands. Jesus isn't the only one giving you and me commands. So is the market. So is social structures in our friend groups. So are leisure and shame and success and the algorithms. We are like getting commanded all day long. And Jesus invites us to consider whose command is best for your heart and for my heart. You know, he himself said it this way. If you love me, keep my commands. So I want to give you a question to reflect on as we wrap up and sing our closing song. Jesus, guide me into seeing every interaction as an opportunity to add value, every resource as an opportunity to multiply good, every choice as an opportunity to obey you, every act of obedience that leads to quality life because you say so. Spend a moment. If you're familiar with prayer, try turning this into an internal prayer. If you're not, I would encourage you to just read the words and have a conversation with God using these words, and we'll sing our closing song.